Actually, I kind of followed my older brother. He was playing accordion, and I never wanted to get into that. And eventually, he found out that he really wasn't interested in it either. So he got into the guitar before I did. After, I think, one Christmas, he might have got a plastic Arthur Godfrey, I guess is who it was that was marketing ukuleles. And he had a plastic ukulele that was his first introduction to strings.
Okay.
And he'd leave it sitting around, and occasionally I'd pick it up, and if it was in tune, I remember he said something about, "My dog has fleas." If you can hum that, you can tune it. So.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, that's pretty goofy, but I was like 7 years old or something like that, and I picked up the ukulele and was able to find a couple of chords on it that sounded pretty good, because I thought the notes went together and it didn't sound too awful to me, and I messed around with that for a while. Meanwhile, he had gotten a guitar for Christmas, an electric guitar, and I was pretty jealous of that, and my parents said, well, when your birthday comes up, maybe we'll get you a guitar because, but it won't be anything electric. So my first guitar was the lowest end Silvertone that Sears Roebuck sold.
Oh, yeah.
It was like $8.
Oh, wow.
Or something like that, made completely out of plywood, and
yeah.
it was kind of rough playing and rough sounding, but it was what I had to learn on. So I played that thing for a couple of years, and meanwhile my brother was, getting better and better on his electric guitar, and of course I wasn't allowed to touch that,
Yeah.
Eventually, when I got older, I traded I got rid of the Sears and Roebuck guitar and got a Sears and Roebuck electric guitar, which was a thin body, and actually, I'll tell you, it was made by Dan Electro. So Silvertone was a brand name that they used for their marketing thing, but they didn't actually manufacture instruments. I found out later that because I had seen a Dan Electro that looked exactly like my guitar, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, these things, Dan Electros are fairly well-regarded instrument," and later on I found out that if you still had one of those things, it was worth some pretty good bucks.
Yeah.
And but like everything else, I traded up or away, and eventually ended up with a Fender Stratocaster in my teens, I guess, because I had gotten into the band business really early, like 13, hooked up with a couple other guys, and we were playing high school functions and dances and little shows around town. But had to have electric guitar because all your buddies have got them, so
yeah,
got to be able to compete.
Right.
And that was my introduction into not professional playing, but made a few bucks. So I guess I was a semi-pro at the time, but still going to school, of course. And I didn't know what bluegrass was because being from Rhode Island, there just wasn't any around that I knew of until a high school friend of mine got interested in it and wanted to learn to play banjo. And I said, "Banjo? What's this?" And he says, "Well, don't you know? It's like, there's a lot of folk music going on these days in bluegrass." And I said, "Well, I'm familiar with the folk music if you're talking about like the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary and stuff like that." And he says, yeah, that's going on as well. But, there's things like Bill Monroe and Flatt and Scruggs and Jimmy Martin. And I said, "Who are these people?" And he said, "Well, he says, I'm interested in taking up banjo." And I said, "Fine." So he says, "Would you like to go to a jam session?" I said, You mean to listen? He said, well, you never know. He says, you know how to play guitar. Somebody might have a guitar there that you can strum. And I said, sure, why not? So went to this guy's house, a mutual friend who was a couple years ahead of us in high school, and they were transplants from West Virginia, down near Lewisburg, and living in nearby town there in Rhode Island. And every now and then they would throw jam sessions and invite all of their bluegrass picking friends over. And that was my first exposure to that. And mandolin, because, I had learned a little bit from my friend, just a basic roll on the banjo, just to see if I could do it. Not that I really was dying to be a banjo player or anything, but, it was intriguing to watch this guy play. And anyway, so we go to the jam session. He breaks out his banjo, and I happen to notice that there's what looks to be a mandolin sitting on the couch there in this living room. And one of the other guys said, pick it up and figure out how to play it. And I said, I've never had my hands on one. And he said, ran his fingers across the strings. He says, it appears to be in tune. He says, why don't you just, take it and mess with it? And that's what I did. So basically, I guess you can call it the Bill Monroe approach, or similarity, that I came into mandolin playing by default. In Monroe's case, it was the instrument in his family that nobody else played, and he was the last one in line, I guess. So
right.
He picked up the mandolin by default and learned how to play it on his own, because evidently he would listen to some of the local players around Rosine and his uncle Penn, who played the fiddle, and figured, this is tuned like a fiddle, so I can learn to play it. And that's basically what I did. I would watch the fiddle players at these jam sessions, because there were no other mandolin players.
Yeah. And
as a matter of fact, the same guy that led me to the mandolin, and he said, do you sing? And I said, yeah. In my rock and roll band, Jimmy G and the Jaguars, I sing the highest part in the trio, because we were doing Beatles tunes and all kinds of stuff. And I did have, back then, a higher range, natural tenor, I guess you could say. And he said, well, you should be playing mandolin, because, that's the instrument that Bill Monroe plays. And again, who's Bill Monroe? It's like, I think I've heard of this guy, but I don't, I hadn't heard him play. I hadn't heard him sing at that point. And, he was just, he's the father of bluegrass. Oh, well, thanks for letting me know, because I didn't know before that.
Yeah.
And he said, well, if you sing the highest part, then you should be playing mandolin. And I said, okay. He says, you can take it home and mess around with it if you want to. So that's what I did. I took it home and learned a few chords, and went back to the jam session and said, well, I've learned some chords, and started strumming these 2-finger chords. And the guy says, no, you got to learn to play chop chords. And I said, what's that? And so he taught me. He said, no, you use all 4 fingers. After that, look out, because I got dangerous once I learned how to chop chords. And he says, you play on the offbeat, not on the onbeat. So I got all my lessons in about the same month. I went from a non-player to a guy that was trying to stand out front chopping chords out of time. And basically the rest is history, because I liked it after a while, and got into better or different players. I discovered there were more players around than were at these jam sessions. And my banjo playing friend took me to a show at a volunteer fire department. And he says, well, here's some other guys that are playing, and they were pretty good. There was actually a mandolin player, a young lady who lived locally, who somebody taught how to play mandolin, and she was much better than me, much better. So I just sat there and watched her play all night long, and really, I was getting the bug by then. I needed a better instrument, and eventually got my hands on a Gibson A model, which I borrowed, and I didn't buy that one. And after that, I found that there was a music store over in Plainfield, Connecticut, which Rhode Island isn't that big, and eastern Connecticut kind of butts up against it, so it wasn't that far away. So my friend and I went over there, and he said, "Oh man, yeah, you need a better mandolin." So I ended up buying. I don't remember. I must have been making payments on it because I don't think I could afford it. It was $175, and it was a Gibson F2 model, oval hole.
Yeah.
And it was much better than anything else that I was using or borrowing at the time. And that was my first purchased mandolin.
You still have that one?
No, that's long gone. But there's, if somebody out there might actually be able to locate or have a copy of the first recording that I did in bluegrass, because I joined a band. I was just barely good enough to be part of a band, and it was called Fred Pike, Bill Rawlings, and the Twin River Boys. And somebody financed, a good friend of ours financed our one and only LP at the time. And if you look at the photo on the front, by then I had gotten to the ripe age of 19 before I got into a bluegrass band. No mustache, and very much, look like a young kid. And I am holding that F2 mandolin, and it's the only photograph that I know of.
Okay.
Where I am playing that, as a matter of fact.
Wow. Well, that's cool to know.
But that's how I got into bluegrass.
After you started learning more about bluegrass and the artists therein, what artists kind of might have shaped your mandolin style after you started becoming more aware of other mandolin players?
John Duffy, to a certain extent. I've loved his rhythm playing. I wasn't really all that keen on the lead, but my favorite player at the time was Bobby Osborne, and he's still one of my favorite players.
Yeah.
Once I heard this tune that he wrote, Surefire, I had to learn it. I slowed that thing down as much as I could. We just happened to have a turntable at the time. Again, it was my brother's, it wasn't mine, but that had a 16 speed thing on it, 16, 33, and then I think it also played 45s and 78s.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I slowed that thing down to 16 and started capturing the notes of that tune. Had no idea what I was doing except trying to mimic what I was hearing. People straightened me out after a while and said, "No, you're not exactly doing that one right," and whatever. And I said, "Well, I'm trying to pick up what I can off of, the records that I've got, and I haven't got that many records."
Yeah, that's a lot harder way to learn too.
Well, that's the way it was. There wasn't instruction books or that I was aware of anyway,
right,
out there.
No YouTube or anything like that.
No, I had no idea. One of the first ones that started getting acclaim was Bluegrass Mandolin by Jack Tottle, and that came along well after I had started messing around with it by myself. So I didn't even get to see what, again, is was regarded as the basic primer, or is that the right pronunciation, or primer, for mandolin playing.
Right.
And I never even found a copy of that later on, because I had gotten hooked up with this guy Fred Pike in the band situation, and he was really a good, accomplished player. I mean, guitar-wise, banjo-wise. I mean, he played guitar like Doc Watson, and he played banjo like Don Reno, and he knew enough about a mandolin to straighten me out about a lot of things, and he'd sit me down and show me what he knew about it, and he knew a lot. So I basically got my chops in from him.
So really, in a lot of ways, you were self-taught on mandolin, just listening to people and learning from what they were doing. And
oh, absolutely, he could only take me so far with it, and lead-wise, he said, listen to some of these players. Don't try to swipe their licks note for note, and I was already trying to do that with Bobby Osborne. So he said, figure it out for yourself. If you want to be an individual or have your own, signature sound, work on it. He said, because he's basically talking about himself. He taught himself how to play banjo like Don Reno and guitar like Doc Watson, and he says, you can do this. He says, I don't have to. I can only take you so far on the mandolin, and then you have to take it from there. So that's what I did. And so what I did, and I am not ashamed to say so, that I took a lot of the licks that I was playing on my electric guitar and started playing these things, and he said, well, there you go. And he says, it may be a guitar lick that you learned from Lonnie Mack or, Chet Atkins or somebody, but you still, you figured out how to incorporate it on the mandolin, and you're getting a pretty good sound there, son, That's what I did.
Well, it worked out well, because you definitely have a signature style. I love your style of mandolin. Well,
thank you. It's something that evolved kind of on its own. And I was, one more story, Fred Pike's brother, Earl, they used to be a team way, way back before I knew them, and the Pike brothers. But Earl Pike was one of the distributors for Rebel Records in New England, and therefore had a connection with Dick Freeland, who owned and started that label years ago. And he was the guy that got the phone call after John Duffy had quit or had turned in his notice to the Country Gentlemen that they were looking for a replacement. And Dick Freeland happened to be talking to Earl Pike and said, John Duffy's going to be quitting the Country Gentlemen. There's somebody coming in from Roanoke that's going to be trying out for the job. Turns out that was Herschel Sizemore.
Oh, wow.
Who was a wonderful mandolin player and a great tenor singer, but evidently he was working for the USPS at the time and wanted the retirement and the job, and he didn't particularly want to relocate. After coming and staying a couple of weeks in D.C., he said, boys, he says, I don't think I'm ready to relocate to D.C. It's a great band and whatever. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to imitate his accent by any means, but he is such a good player, but he wanted to be back in Roanoke, with his family and go back to his job. So they were in a fix, the Country Gentlemen, that is, because they had a tour of Japan lined up through Mike Seeger, who had connections over there, and they needed to have somebody like yesterday. Again, Dick Freeland contacts his distributor, Earl Pike, up in Connecticut and says, isn't there a guy up there that plays with your brother that's pretty good? And Earl says, yeah, he's getting to be pretty good, and he's a good tenor singer. And so he said, give me his phone number. And lo and behold, one night the phone rings, and hi, my name is Dick Freeland, and I run Rebel Records, and and I said, well, I'm familiar with that because I've heard many a country gentleman recording. By that time, I'm talking 1969.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was already into my 20s, and he said, well, John Duffy has given his notice, and the country gentlemen need a mandolin player that sings tenor. Are you interested? And I said, yes, because I knew if I had hesitated and said, well, I'll call you back, he would have just gone on to the next name or whatever, or, that would have been it. And I said, yes, I definitely am interested. And he says, how soon can you get down here and try out? You need to audition. And I said, I was like 2 days, whatever. And got on a plane, came down here to the D.C. area, and Dick Freeland picked me up at what was then just referred to as National Airport. Now it's Reagan National Airport. And we went down to nearby Alexandria, where Charlie Waller had his RV bus parked. And I met with him, Ed Ferris, who was the bass player at the time, and Eddie Adcock. And they said, I'd been there like 3 or 4 minutes and gotten to know them, and they said, get that mandolin out, boy, and we'll see what you know. So I, was familiar with some of their repertoire, not all of their songs by any means, but I had listened to enough stuff that, and they only wanted to hear, like a half a dozen tunes, and I started naming them off, the ones that I knew, and they got into it. And this is a story that I had told to Katie Daly recently, because she had heard this many, many years ago. I told her about this audition that with Charlie and Eddie and Ed, and I said, well, bringing Mary home. Of course, I'm fresh out of Rhode Island, so I have had much more of a Rhode Islandese accent back then. And when it came to the line, I looked all around the car, but Mary wasn't there. Charlie said, wait a minute. He said, you're doing fine with the mandolin playing. He says, but you got to do something about that accent. He said, I said, what accent? Trying to be funny. And Eddie cracked up. He said, nah. He says, it'll come to you. He says, well, we like you playing and you're singing. Do you want a job, basically? And I said, yeah. And so I didn't even go back home after that. I stayed. I had enough clothes with me. He says, we got a job coming up like this weekend. You need to brush up on some more of our material. And I said, well, Charlie says, I got all the LPs at home. He says, and you'll be bunking in. He had a roommate, a female friend at the time, that had a sewing room in their apartment, and they had a tiny cot in there, and they said, you can bunk in there until you find a place to live, So that's where I spent my days listening to country gentleman LPs in his apartment. I would be listening to the LPs while he was listening to me practice and working on my accent. So by the time the gig came up on the weekend, I could get at least through 2 sets of music. And the rest is history from there. I stayed with him up until 1971. So it was like from the frying pan right directly into the fire.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess you did the Japan tour with them then also.
Ironically, here's what happened. One of the first things that they did was they took me to the Japanese embassy here in D.C. to expedite getting my passport. I got it, and I've still got it, as a matter of fact. And it's unstamped because the tour never happened.
Oh, okay.
Somewhere within the second week, I think, of me being down here, Mike Seeger called Charlie and Eddie and said, "Boys, I got some bad news for you. The tour has been canceled." And the reason that it was canceled is because John Duffy wasn't going to be part of it. They thought that, when they hired the country gentleman, that they were going to be getting the country gentleman with John Duffy. And one of the reasons I found out later was that John had no desire to go to Japan, or he didn't want to even get on an airplane. He was not keen on flying.
Yeah.
And he said, "I just as soon leave the group." And that's what he did.
Wow. Okay.
But, they hadn't gotten the word yet that the tour had been canceled, because obviously they had taken me to get the passport and things. And, it was disappointing for everybody. I was looking forward to it,
Yeah.
It just wasn't going to happen. I did get to go to Japan first with J.D. Crowe, and then later with Spectrum. So
right.
I did get to sing and play in Japan a couple of times.
Yeah. What was it like working with Charlie Waller?
Interesting. He's a pretty resourceful guy, a great singer. That's what really honed what became, for lack of a better term, really had to listen to the lead singers in the bands, the many bands that I played with throughout my career. And listening close, you had to get the phrasing down. And Charlie was really good at enunciation. He didn't slur words or go over things that you'd miss. Every word that he sung, you heard. And after hanging out with him and playing many gigs, I got the knack of it. And one of the things that happened, like in the second month, maybe, that I was playing with them, they had a regular gig at a club in downtown D.C., the Georgetown section of D.C., called the Shamrock. And they basically worked up all their material there before taking it out on the road. And this was, I think, by then, 2 nights a week. I think it was like Monday and Tuesday, or Tuesday and Wednesday. Yeah, I think it was like Monday and Tuesday nights from 9 to 1, or 9 to 2, maybe, because we did 4 sets. I'll tell you, after a night of that, it was like, and then have to come back in the next night.
Yeah.
One of the nights I showed up with my mandolin, I come strolling through the door, and people are whispering. And somebody come over to me and said, "Duffy's in the house." And I said, "Oh, really?" And sure enough, right up not in the very front table, but maybe one back, John and his wife Nancy were sitting there, and I go directly to the kitchen area where, we'd park our instrument cases and stuff like that. And I said to Eddie Adcock, "John Duffy's out in the house tonight." He says, "Yeah, I know." Like, so what? You're in this job now. You got the job. The Seldom Seen hadn't started yet, so John was basically doing repair work and instrument stuff for Arlington Music. I don't think he had intentions at the time of going back in the band business, but anyway, he was curious enough to come down and catch me shaking in my shoes at the Shamrock. And the first set, I literally was. I looked down at my pants leg, and it was waving like a flag, man. I just, Eddie said, "Get over it, it's, you know what you're doing. Calm down, And I said, "Oh." So I managed to get through that set okay. and then came out during the break, and John signaled me over to his table, I met him and his wife, and he said, sit down, have a seat, and join us. And I'm sounding like Jackie Gleason, humana. I'm sitting at the table with John Duffy, one of my heroes, and the guy that I'm supposedly replacing. And I even hesitate to use that term because I am the kid off the street, and there's nobody filling that man's shoes, that's for sure. So I'm just trying to be me. And he says, I like what you're doing. You obviously got the tenor range down. He says, I already heard the story from Charlie about your accent. So I said, yeah, what can I say? I'm from Rhode Island. He says, well, it'll come. Don't worry about it. He says, you're worrying about too much. And he says, then if I can give you any tip at all, he says, it's, your mandolin playing is great, but you're not selling it. And I said, what do you mean? He says, you are more technician. It appears that you are more of a technician than you are a showman. And I said, well, that's very likely. Because, I'm like only into my second month on this job. And he said, you got to be able to sell it. He says, it got me many years of acclaim and a reputation. He says I was probably had a reputation of being a better showman than a mandolin player, and I just kind of rolled my eyes like I said, oh, I don't know about that, but because I hadn't seen him perform, I didn't know. Heard the records, but he says work on that some, and for the next 50 years. I worked on it, and I had to work on it because, I found out that I'm not a natural showman. I am more of a guy that probably could play in many bands and did as a sideman, as long as I didn't have to be the front man, and I didn't with the gentleman either. Charlie assumed that after John left. And so he was kind of working on that too, Charlie said, I'm not a natural at this either. So, if John tells you to work on your showmanship, he says, I'm trying to do the same thing, with being the front man of this group, because he did it all those years. He did it all. Yeah. And so, we were all kind of in the same boat. And but we ended up doing the first recording was called New Look, New Sound, and by that time, actually, I don't know the entire story, but they had replaced Ed Ferris as well as the bass player. Okay. And got another Ed McLaughlin to play bass, and we did our first recording for Rebel, of which I didn't really have any say-so in selection of material or anything. Eddie and Charlie, Eddie more so than Charlie, picked out material for that particular LP. And I believe that there's still available. Rebel, I think, put it in a box set, most of the material from that old recording. Yeah. And it's out there. I ended up doing 3 during my tenure with that group. New Look, New Sound, One Wide River to Cross, which was a gospel album, and then what was golly, I'm trying to think of the last one. Sound Off, yes, because we had our photos taken over at Fort Washington next to a gigantic old cannon, and that was the one that had. I had a lot to do with picking some of the material for that, and two of which became kind of standards. Bill Emerson was the banjo player by that time, and actually on One Wide River to Cross, he was the banjo player on that album as well. Yeah. But he unearthed Fox on the Run, which he had already did a previous recording with Cliff Waldron, but it didn't go nearly as far or become as widely known as the Country Gentleman version that was on Sound Off.
Yeah.
And the other tune that was on there that became copied many times was Teach Your Children,
Oh, yeah.
which I had just gotten from, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young.
Mm-hmm.
Neil Young was on that recording, and none of the bluegrass groups had picked it up up till that point. And I said, look, boys, this is a natural for us here. And Charlie liked it, and
yeah, that is a great
it
song.
ended up on that recording.
So what year did you leave the Country Gentleman the first time around?
1971.
71.
And that's kind of a story that I don't. It wasn't that I wanted to leave so bad or that I was tired of playing with the group by any means, but Eddie Adcock had come back on the scene. The Seldom Scene was up and running by that time, so they were in the area playing gigs, and Eddie, after a mysterious disappearance, for lack of a better term, came back and wanted to start a band. And he approached me and he said, you want a little bit more freedom in material and whatever? He says, I think we might be able to interest Tony Royce into coming with us, But anyway, that didn't happen. But I had already kind of given my notice to Charlie and Bill Emerson and Bill Yates at the time, and said, I just want to try something else. And they said, go ahead. We don't want to hold you back. So that's when we formed the Second Generation, and that for me was kind of short-lived, just barely over a year, because yes, I did have some artistic freedom, but some of the material that Eddie and Wendy Thatcher, his girlfriend at the time and lead singer for Second Generation, she was picking out some stuff too, and by the end of that first year, I didn't like the direction that the group was headed material-wise, and the fact that we were traveling too far for too little.
Yeah.
To put it bluntly,
Right.
Eddie just said, we got a gig in Kentucky and it pays, $200 or something like that. And wow, well, you kidding? We're driving all the way out there for, well, yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, we were doing so many gigs out in that part of the country that we relocated. The band picked up and relocated to Columbus, Ohio, and that didn't set well with me either. I mean, I adapted to it barely, but I didn't want to spend, too many years out there.
Yeah.
And was looking for an opportunity to get. I liked the D.C. area. One day, the day came when I just told Eddie, I said, look, I don't like the direction this band is going, and I'm going to try something on my own. And he said, go for it. He says, if you, want to do something else. So I recruited Keith Whitley and at the time Carl Jackson on banjo. I was still living in Columbus, and I recruited my old buddy Bill Rawlings, who by the time he resurfaced in music, he was the original guitar player in Fred Pike, Bill Rawlings, and the Twin River Boys. But when he came down to D.C., he had the opportunity to play bass with one of his heroes, Buzz Busby and Leon Morris. They needed a bass player, and I said, they're looking for a bass player. And he says, well, I'll just learn how to play bass. So he learned how to play bass, and I recruited him out of D.C. to come out and play some of the first licks and gigs with us around the Columbus area. And strangely, or ironically, what happened, the Columbus or Ohio State Fair. Took place in northern part of Columbus. And Carl said, well, Keith and I are going out there tonight, and I want to see Glenn Campbell play. And his banjo player is one of my heroes. He says, I really want to, go out and listen to him. And I, kind of balked at it. I said, no, I don't want to, I had other plans or something. Anyway, it was nice to kind of get those guys out of the house for a while. And I said, go and have a good time. Anyway, they came back that night, and I said, how was the show? And they said, it was great. Glenn Campbell, of course, was great. And Keith, decided, he says, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. And so they were both staying with me at the time, and went off to their respective, or Keith did. And Carl said, I got something to tell you. And I said, okay, what's up? He says, I got talking with Larry McNeely. He saw me, as they were leaving stage, and he motioned me over. And he said, hey, Carl, how you doing? It's good to see you. And he said, yeah, I really enjoyed your banjo playing. He said, well, I got to tell you something. I'm leaving soon. I've given Glenn my notice, and he's in the market for a good, really good banjo player, and I think you might fill the bill. And Carl says, me? He said, yeah, if you want to come back tomorrow and audition. He says, this is going to be a little tricky here. He says, I'm here to play with Keith and Jimmy Gaudreau and this band that we've already started up, and up to you. So Carl, laid out the facts in front of me. He says, Glenn would like to audition me like tomorrow. And he says, I'm going to tell you right up front. He says, I'm here you got me here from Mississippi to play banjo, and I'll stick to, my word. I'll stay with you if that's what you want. And I said, Carl, I said, opportunities like this don't come along even like once in a lifetime for most people. I said, and you got the chance of a lifetime. I said, I'm not going to be a guy that tells you, nah, forget the audition and stick with me. Go do that audition, and I'm sure you'll do fine. And he says, I was hoping you'd say that, so we.
Yeah.
I think it was one of the first hugs that I have ever got. He just put his arms around me, and he was almost in tears. He said, I was just so afraid that, that not going to look at it that way. And I said, get out there, and make me proud. And he did. He had that job, held it for many, many years. And, that's well documented, the part that he played in the Glenn Campbell show from that point on.
Right.
Right up until practically, I guess, Glenn's passing.
Right.
Anyway, that's that story.
Out of that, I guess, was J.D. Crowe?
No, I kept that band going for a couple of years, and went through many banjo players. I can't even name them all, as a matter of fact. And Keith stuck with me through a couple, or maybe a year and a half, moved back to D.C., because I said, I'm through with Columbus. I want to get back to D.C., and I said, I know we can get gigs back there. I got enough connections and, keep us afloat. And that's what we did. And an unfortunate, terrible thing happened. Keith and Ricky Skaggs had been kind of done an apprenticeship in their mid-teens with Ralph Stanley, and appeared on some of Ralph's albums. At the time, Ralph's lead singer, Roy Lee Centers, was the number one guy, and when Keith was like the background rhythm guitar player. Well, a while, I don't know, a year, maybe maybe not even that long. Roy Lee Centers was tragically murdered.
Yeah.
And Keith went to the funeral, of course, and Ralph came up to him after the service and said, "Well, Keith, you know, I'm in a terrible position here now with Roy gone, and I need a lead singer, and I'd like to have you back as the front man." And so Keith came back to me, you know, and said, "Jimmy, I got to do it, you know." He says, I owe a lot to Ralph getting me started, and he needs me, you know, and I want to do it. You know, I want to get back closer to home, move back. And he says, and, you know, it's not like I don't like the music we're playing, whatever, but he says, I want to go back to Kentucky, which is what he did.
Yeah.
And I kept the band going with yet another lead singer by the name of Chris Stiefel, who I recruited. You know, the word had gotten around by then that, you know, Jimmy Gaudreau is in the market for a lead singer, and there were people auditioning all over the place. Once I heard Chris sing, I said, "Well, you got the job." He says, "Fine, let's get to work." So we then cut another, our first and only CD for Rebel Records, and it was just called Country Store, with Dick Smith playing banjo, again Bill Rawlings on bass, and Chris Stiefel playing guitar, and me on mandolin. There may be copies of that around somewhere.
I know there's one on YouTube that somebody's uploaded on there. I think that one's with the one with Keith Whitley, though, Country Store.
If it is, that's from a live recording.
Oh, okay.
That one wasn't even authorized. I had no idea that one was. There was one that was recorded at the Shamrock on a home-style reel-to-reel recorder, and I didn't. You know, I had no idea that it was ever going to become an album. And then there was one out of Hugo, Oklahoma, that we recorded. We were missing a banjo player at the time, but we had the gig booked. So I talked to the promoter out there, and I said, "Do you still want us to come out?" And he says, "Yeah." He says, "You wouldn't mind having Alan Mundy play banjo with you, would you?" I said, "Oh, are you kidding me?" I said, I'd be honored. And so Rawlings and Whitley and I jumped into a vehicle and drove out to Hugo, Oklahoma, and again, it wasn't supposed to turn into an album, but somebody recorded one of the sets, and it came out on, I can't even remember the label name, but
yeah, it
was called, the band by that time had changed names. We had gone through so many banjo players and configurations, and that we decided, you know, let's change the name of the band. So we changed it to New Tradition, and it was called New Tradition Live.
Okay.
And somebody sent me a copy of it, and I said, "What?" You know, and they said, "Yeah, you know, you'll get your royalties and everything on it." I said, you know, I'm thinking, I didn't even sign a contract for this thing. And here it is, it's out, you know.
Yeah.
And there's probably copies of that around places too, but
yeah,
featuring Alan Mundy on banjo. But after that, after Keith left the group and Chris joined, we did the Rebel album. And I had gone through so many banjo players at the time, and this was around 1975, I guess. It was exactly 1975, because Dick Smith was playing banjo with us, and he had the opportunity to go with Del McCoury, which at that time, Del's kids weren't even playing in the band. They were too young. It was called Del McCoury and the Dixie Pals. You know, Del's a great singer and guitar player, and Dick was a Pennsylvania boy, you know, and he said, I want to go with Del. And I said, have at it, you have my blessing. And so Chris and Bill Rawlings said, well, looks like we're in the market for a new banjo player. And I said, whatever, and before I could even think of anybody, I got the word that Tony Rice and Ricky Skaggs and Jerry Douglas were leaving J.D. Crowe, and Crowe was trying to rebuild his band and had like a permanent gig, built-in gig at the Holiday Inn out in Lexington, Kentucky. And I thought to myself, I'm going to give Crowe a call and just see what's up,
Yeah.
And so I talked to JD, and he says, yeah, you heard right, those guys are left and gone their separate ways, and I've still got a gig out here, and I've got Glenn Lawson, who was playing mandolin with me at the time, and he would just as soon be playing guitar, but he had Harley Allen at the time playing guitar, and he was much more, Harley's great lead singer, oh my golly, and really good guitar player, and Glenn was struggling a bit to be a mandolin player, and he said, well, if you can get Jimmy to move out here, he says, I would gladly take over the duties of lead singer, guitar player. And Crowe says, well, let's get him out here and see how it sounds. So drove out to Lexington, Kentucky, and hit some licks with those guys, and Crowe says, you want the gig, you got it. So that was basically how that happened. I came back and I told those guys, I said, look, I am just really, really tired of having to look for banjo players, be the booking agent, and take care of running a group. I need to be working with or for somebody else, and this is a built-in opportunity for me, and they were not so happy about that idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was like, oh, you're going to abandon us now, and it's like, after this long, and we're not really going anywhere, kind of spinning our wheels here. The Seldom Seen was the dominant group in D.C. by that time, by a long shot. And I said, we're never going to hit the kind of notoriety that group has gotten in they started in, I think, late 71, and now I'm talking 1975. So in the course of a few short years, they had really brought that group from nothing to right to the top.
Right.
So I said, I'm not going to sit around here and just spin my wheels. I gotta go. I gotta find my own way here, and working with Crowe is going to improve my chops. It's going to, it's going to give me a higher profile.
Right.
And I need that right now. And I need a steady paycheck. That's what I need. Move to Kentucky. I wasn't exactly, keen on leaving the D.C. area, but, I couldn't let an opportunity like that pass me by. So there I go. And I was married at the time, so my wife and I moved to Kentucky, ended up buying a house there in Lexington. She ended up going back to school, University of Kentucky, to finish off her degree, and then she stayed and got advanced degrees right up to a PhD from University of Kentucky. And so I stayed with Crowe for right up until 1978 or 9, I guess, or something like that. And by that time, Glenn had left the group. Keith Whitley had decided actually, I recruited him. I went down to, after Glenn Lawson left, Crowe says, well, we need a lead singer, and you think Keith is ready yet? And I says, I'll drive over to Sandy Hook, Kentucky, and I'll just see. So went over there and spent the day with him, and he says, I know why you're here. You want me to think about going, he says, with J.D. Crowe, right? I said, yeah. I said, well, he said, I won't say no yet. He said, but I'll come down and we'll see how it sounds. And, he stayed with Crowe longer than I did because, then Keith went on to get, start his career in commercial country music. He was, a huge success. And if you don't know the story, he died tragically in 1989.
Yeah.
I won't get into that, but, one of the best lead singers to ever open his mouth in front of a microphone, in my estimation. He was exceptional.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite record that you made with JD? You were on what, You Can Share My Blanket and My Home Ain't in the Hall of Fame. Is that the two?
Yeah, and the first one was with Glenn Lawson singing lead, and the other one was, of course, with Keith Whitley singing lead. And I would have a hard time picking between either one of them. There were certain tunes on both of those LPs that I really liked. I can tell you that after singing with Keith in that band, he pushed me harder than any other lead singer that I ever attempted to sing with. Not that I couldn't do it, but he had me at the top of my range like all of the time, and it was rough. It really was.
Kind of like Monroe said, singing again, somebody.
Yeah. It was a completely different experience than singing with Glenn Lawson, who sung in a lower range. And Glenn was easy to sing with. Keith pushed me hard. And that's one of the reasons that Glenn approached me in 1979 after going out to one of the festivals and jamming with Bela Fleck and Mark Schatz, who were playing with the aforementioned Jack Tottle in a band with Pat Enright. Does that name ring a bell? He went on to work with the Nashville Bluegrass Band.
Yeah. Was that the Tasty Licks band? Is that the one?
That was Tasty Licks.
Yeah.
Right. So Glenn got in a jam session with these guys and said that, that Bela and Mark were looking to move on. They had run their course with the Boston area and wanted to get down in where things were happening, and and I said, I don't know. He said, they're playing out at the Holiday Inn, Tasty Licks. He says, go out and listen to them. So I did, and the minute that I heard Bela Fleck play a banjo, it was like, I have not heard anything like that before. I had gone through banjo player after banjo player, and was working with J.D. Crowe, who was, as traditional banjo player, he's one of the guys that you count on one hand. So,
right.
But Bela Fleck, he's a completely different everything. He was making it up and doing very well, writing his own tunes. And Glenn said, these guys want to get in the band business like soon. And I said, oh man, that would, it kind of put me in a rough position of having to leave JD. And JD's nice guy, Mr. Nice Guy. He said, well, he says, if that's what you want to do, he says, we'll miss you, but, if that's what you want to do, give it a shot, we only go around once. So I did. I turned in my notice, and next thing you know, we were in the band business and living in Lexington, and got a few gigs right there at that same Holiday Inn and festivals as Spectrum, and ended up getting a record deal through Rounder, who, of course, that's who JD was with at the time. and Ken Irwin and company, had heard about, they knew about Bela Fleck, of course, because they had already cut, I think, the Tasty Licks album. So they wanted to hear this band, and as soon as they did, it's like, yeah, we'll give you a budget, and you give us an album. So we cut one opening roll, it was called, with that configuration. Started getting a bunch of gigs. It lasted up until like about 1981, so 2.5 years, something like that. And then Bela got the opportunity to go with Newgrass Revival.
Yeah.
Sam had heard him play and said, that's the guy that we need right there.
Yeah.
And that pretty much finished off Spectrum.
Yeah. Well, you guys made some great music.
My heart isn't in it anymore. And Mark Schatt says, Bela's moving to Nashville, and I think I'll just move down there and kind of wing it. And, because Mark could play electric and upright bass. He was really an accomplished musician.
Yeah.
And he says, I won't find too hard getting work down there. So he moved, and before I could even pick up the phone, basically, and try to piece something back together, the phone rings. And it's Bill Yates. And he said, I understand the word had already gotten back to D.C. that Spectrum was breaking up. And he says, before you start making any moves and recruiting people, he says, I'm going to make you another offer here that you might want to hear. And I said, oh, boy. So he said, I'd like you to come back to the Country Gentlemen. The guys, Ken and Rick Allred, I think, was playing mandolin at the time. And all I remember was Kenny something. I can't recall his name. Playing banjo, and they both wanted to leave, or I don't know the circumstances. But anyway, Yates and Charlie were in the market for a banjo player and a mandolin player, tenor singing mandolin player. And he said, you're the first one I thought of. And when I heard that Spectrum was breaking up, we'll offer you the job. You want to get back to D.C.? He says, but it'll be different this time. It'll be a salaried position. We'll offer you, and it was more money than I was making. And it was guaranteed every week, whether I worked or not. It was I was on the payroll. I discussed it with my wife, and she says, yeah, I wouldn't mind getting back to D.C. Why not? Sounds like a good gig to me. The only problem that I had, and I told Bill Yates, I said, well, who you got in mind for a banjo player? He says, well, we got several in mind, and he started going down through a list of people, and I said, have you ever thought of Dick Smith? And he said, didn't he used to work with you in the country store, or whatever you were called back then? And I said, yeah. I said, he's working with Del McCurry now, and if you're offering the same kind of a position type thing, salaried employee, he might be interested. And he said, He said, I'll find out. And so I got him in touch with Dick, and Dick was ready. Dick said, he had gone, I guess, about as far as he wanted to with Del, and liked the Country Gentleman music for sure. So he wanted to be part of that band, and he joined up. So that was my second stint with the Country Gentlemen.
Well, you've done so much, Jimmy. It's hard to get through it all, isn't it?
It is hard to get through it all. Yeah, but I think I've named most of the groups that I went through. Of course, I went from the Country Gentlemen second time into the Tony Rice unit.
Yeah.
So, and that took the next 10 years of my life.
Yeah.
85 to 90, well, technically 95. Tony quit singing in 94.
Yeah.
But the band still operated and took some gigs into 95, so it was the better part of 10 years.
I'm sure that was quite an experience.
Oh, that was an experience, believe me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that really sharpened up my chops.
Yeah.
Getting to play with Tony.
Yeah.
And he was a pleasure to sing with too. I mean, just
Oh, yeah.
I loved the fact that he was into the lower register that didn't push me too hard vocal wise.
Yeah.
So it was a good run while it lasted.
Yeah. And then I guess Chesapeake come out of after the Tony Rice unit.
Yeah, we operated simultaneously for a while.
Okay.
I was working with Tony. Tony was, at the time, struggling to sing in the early 90s. And you could hear it showing up more and more.
Right.
Until that fatal day in 94 when he come off of the stage after doing a reunion concert with J.D. Crowe and the New South, and he pointed to his throat and he says, "That's it." And Ricky Simpkins and I were standing there kind of looking at each other, and I said, "What do you mean that's it?" And he says, "I ain't singing anymore."
Yeah.
And he didn't. I mean, from that day forward, that was it.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, what do we do?" He says, "We still got gigs to play." He says, "You and Ricky figure that out."
Yeah.
So it was the Jimmy and Ricky duet for the last gigs that we played with that band.
Yeah.
But it was, I could see the writing on the wall, and
Right.
I had met Moondy through some mutual friends and heard him sing, and I said, "Oh my, I gotta sing in some capacity with this guy because he's right up there among the best lead singers that I've ever sung with in my entire life."
Absolutely.
The guy was a vocal genius, acrobat. He could do anything, and still can. He was operatically trained, had a range that was unbelievable.
Yeah.
And that's how Chesapeake got started as a side group, because Mike Aldridge and T. Michael Coleman were still working with the Seldom Scene, but Mike wanted to play his steel more, and that was not ever going to be part of the Seldom Scene act. And he said, as long as we can do, local gigs or whatever, and, maybe a few festivals, he says, but, we don't have any intention of leaving the Seldom Scene. But that eventually did happen. So I don't really want to go into that, but eventually, like in 1996 or something like that, they served their notices, and we were going to go on as Chesapeake.
One thing I think
and did for a few years.
Yeah. One thing I think was cool about Chesapeake, Jimmy, is it seemed to let you loose even more to, I'm thinking some of your awesome solos on some of those records, like Rain and Snow. I mean, you could really let loose on some of that stuff, and it was just mind-boggling.
Well, that was like Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again.
Yeah.
Because I like this, like I started out saying, I was a guitar player first, and an electric guitar player before I had gotten into mandolin. Well, I was kind of reverting back to my electric guitar days, because in Chesapeake we were all plugged in, and I started playing the mandolin that I was using with the Tony Rice unit, but I was told in very, very definite terms, if you're going to compete with the rest of those guys on stage, you're going to have to, get rid of the microphone thing and start plugging in. So
yeah.
Anyway, that got me hooked up with Rigel instruments, and my first inboard electric mandolin. So I plugged in with the rest of them, and next thing you know, there I was. Playing plugged in.
Well, I wanted to kind of ask you a few questions. I know I've kept you on here a long time. I appreciate you talking with me. I don't want to wear you out, though. But,
of
course, you went on to Aldridge, Bennett, Gaudreau, and did a couple of great albums. And but I want to talk to you some about your couple of specific things on your mandolin playing.
Okay.
One thing I really like, it's kind of unique to you, although I try to copy it sometimes in my playing, is how you'll walk a double stop up the neck and then back down again. That's a really cool thing you come up with there that's unique to you.
Probably stolen from some guitar player or steel player. I listened a lot to steel players throughout my career, and the slides and the pull-offs and the hammers and the notes that bend up and or come from a half step down and up, and double stops. Listen to a lot of fiddle players.
Yeah.
And I can't say that I came up with that stuff consciously. It just showed up in my playing, as that sounds pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And that's the way I would approach things, especially having going through a tenure with Tony Rice, who I got to tell you, all of those albums that you hear of the Tony Rice unit that I'm on anyway, we worked up in the studio.
Yeah.
We lived in different parts of the country, rarely practiced, and when we did, it was like before a gig behind stage, in the dressing room or whatever. And all of those albums, because Tony says, I want your breaks to be spontaneous.
Yeah.
I don't want you to put a lot of forethought into this stuff. He says, that's the way I play, and that's the way I'd like to see you and Ricky play. And Ricky says, I have no problem with that. And I said, well, I guess I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
So that's how my playing evolved. It's not that I purposely tried to invent that stuff. It just kind of came out one day, either in the studio or I call it mindless playing, noodling. I'd sit up and watch the late news and always have a mandolin sitting there, not necessarily my Rigel or Paganini or whatever I had. I kept an old Gibson A model within reach of where I was sitting, and if I was watching the late news or the late night talk shows, I would be kind of like mindlessly inventing tunes and noodling around, and that's how most of my tunes that I've ever written came to be. Just, something would catch my ear, and I'd say, oh, that sounds pretty good, and I'd write a tune around it.
Is that how some of the stuff on Classic Jag come together, including that tune?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't set out to write that tune. It just, the chord progression came first, and then the tune later.
How did Classic Jag come about? Did somebody, and it was on Webco originally, wasn't it?
I believe it was. Bill Emerson got me hooked up with, it was actually Buzz Busby's brother. Their family name was Busbice, Busbice, I believe. And Wayne Busbice owned the record label at the time. Webco, yeah. W-E-B, right. Wayne E. Busbice was Webco Records. Okay. And that's who Emerson was recording, I guess, some of his early banjo albums. And he got me hooked up with Wayne and said, Jimmy's got some both instrumental and vocal stuff that Wayne says, well, let's get him in the studio, and that's how that came about. So that's my old buddy Bill Emerson takes responsibility for hooking me up with that one.
Okay. Well, I really like that album. That's
Thank you.
Good record. What about your tremolo technique, Jimmy? That's something too that I really like. You do a lot of tremolo, and I know you told me one time in an email that you would like to hear more mandolin players use tremolo technique.
Yeah, mine is kind of a modified version of again the aforementioned Buzz Busby, who was the master of tremolo in my book. And John Duffy had a really good tremolo as well. So I would listen to both of those guys, and they were both here in the D.C. area, when I first came down here. So I would, listen to them play, and I heard the Country Gentleman records, of course. So I captured some of that, John's tremolo playing, off of the early Country Gentleman records. But once I got to see Buzz Busby perform, it was like, oh my, that was amazing. And you talk about being able to play double stops up and down the neck while playing tremolo. That was a trick that I can do it, not to the degree that Buzz demonstrated by any means. I won't put myself in that league. He was the master of stuff like that, and I'll tell you, he was a sight to behold.
Yeah. Well, I know one break that comes to mind, a recorded break, is on Tony's Me and My Guitar album. I think it's 16 Miles, the break you took on there with a lot of tremolo. That was really pretty.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Again, it wasn't rehearsed. We cut that song right after we worked it up in the outer part of the studio, and then went into the recording studio and cut it head on.
Wow.
And I couldn't think of anything more appropriate at the time. And Tony says, yeah, he says, try, just make something fit there. And entirely off the cuff. But,
wow.
I knew how to play tremolo and I knew the chords, so
yeah,
instant break.
Yeah. Well, speaking of recording, do you have favorite microphones to record your mandolin with?
The Neumann U87 was, and sometimes another. It depends. Different recording engineers would have techniques, their own techniques, but usually one of them was pointed right at the F hole, the bottom F hole, and the other one, for one reason or another, I'm not a recording engineer, but they would like to get some of the ambience or the sharper tones right off of the neck area, like midway up the neck. So there was a couple of spaced out, differently spaced, that is, microphones in front of me.
Okay.
And just about every recording. I don't think I can't recall ever. No, I take that back. The earlier recordings, like the first time around with the Country Gentleman and like that, a lot of it was still around two mics. One for the vocals, singing around one mic, and a mic for one mic for your instrument. And I can't. That's over 50 years ago, so I cannot tell you what that microphone was.
Yeah.
I can tell you that for the Rode mandolins that I used, just the regular old Shure SM58 for vocals, and an AKG C1000, which Richard Bennett and I bought. We bought a pair of them when we were with the ABG out in playing a gig out in Oregon, I think.
Oh, yeah.
We ran across this guy that had, the promoter, I think, ran a music store, and he says, I'll give you guys a sweet deal on these things. And Richard and I ended up buying the pair.
Yeah.
And I've still got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's my stage microphone of choice.
So do you still play some, even though you're kind of technically retired, I guess, but do you still play out any?
No.
No.
I play around the house. That's it. And I think that's about all anybody's doing these days. So, I'm still a late night player after my wife goes to bed. I'll stay up and still mindlessly pick up a mandolin, and although I got a different one these days, but no, I don't do it with the intention of writing a tune.
Yeah.
But then again, I never did it with the intention of writing a tune.
Yeah.
It just happened to come, and evolve from noodling.
Yeah.
And just trying to keep my fingers nimble and my calluses still tough.
Yeah.
As they say. And when my wife retired from her day job, she worked for Geico Insurance for like 38 years and finally retired, and she says, I want to learn how to play guitar. So I bought her a nice, what I call a really nice guitar. It's a Blue Ridge, not a Martin by any means, but very, very nice guitar.
Mm-hmm.
And taught her the basic chords, and actually some of the bar chords too. And she figured it right out.
Yeah.
So we strum a few tunes together a bit.
Well, that's great.
She has no intention of getting out on the front porch and playing for the neighbors. She says, no. I see it done on TV, but we'll not be doing that.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on the current bluegrass music scene? Of course, I say current before the COVID thing hit. Nobody's playing right now, but like the songs you're hearing today, do you have any thoughts on the bands and the type of material that's going on nowadays?
I would be reluctant to elaborate on that. I am guilty of not knowing who was out there. I mean, I'm familiar with a few of the heavy hitters, like Sierra Hull, and I did get to see her band perform, and they're incredible. And of course, my favorite, I got to say, I'm a Gibson Brothers fan. I love those guys.
Yeah.
And I got to play with them a few years back.
Oh, awesome.
Their mandolin player, his grandmother died or something, and he had short notice, had to fly off, to a faraway state or whatever, and the phone rings, and it's Lee Gibson. And he said, Jimmy, yes? He says, I know you're somewhat of a fan. He says, would you like to play a gig with us? And I said, when? He says, like 2 days from now. And I said, what? He says, yeah. He says, we're playing in Gettysburg at the Gettysburg Bluegrass Festival, and our mandolin player's got to leave. He can't make the gig. He says, I need somebody that knows our material and can fill in. And I says, you're kidding me, right? And he said, no. He says, I'm serious as can be. He says, you would be helping us out a lot. And I said, well, give me a list of tunes. I said, you throw me any curves and stuff that I said, I know that you play some stuff that is incredibly fast.
Yeah.
He said, no, we'll duck that stuff. I'll give you a list of tunes that I'm sure you can handle. And he did. And it was, I gotta say, one of the most fun gigs that I've ever played. I mean, my wife was watching from the audience. She says, I can't even remember the last time I saw you so happy.
Yeah.
And enjoy playing so much.
Yeah.
But it was just, I was bouncing around the stage because, I love their singing. And I guess, who was it, Mike Barber playing the bass with them, and still is, I guess. But his bass playing between him and Lee's rhythm playing on the guitar, it's like a freight train. I mean, if you can't play to that, go to the house, as they say.
Really.
As JD would say, might as well go to the house.
Yeah.
So it was just, once they found that groove and they did that like right away, you just fell in with it. And man, I'll tell you what, I don't have a recording of it, but I wish I could find one.
Yeah.
Somebody somewhere probably does.
Yeah, probably so. Well, one final question for you. What does Jimmy Gaudreau do for fun when you're not playing music nowadays, and you have hobbies or something else you enjoy?
Not that you would call real hobbies. I do a bit of crude woodworking and things out in the garage. I have just about every tool known to man, and I like to fix things, and and I don't mind doing yard work, really, especially this time of year. So we've got our lawn looking like a golf course right now. And mostly due to my cutting and my wife's being able to feed it the right stuff.
Yeah.
But, and then I am trying to sharpen my computer skills because I am of the Luddite variety when it comes to that. She was a computer programmer with Geico, so when I had questions and things, but I still I got a lot to learn on as far as basic operation or anything to do with computer. I can do emails, I can find the internet, and I can barely type. So,
well, and it changes all the time.
And it changes all the time,
yeah.
right? But, I'm keeping busy. We try to exercise a lot. We do yoga once a week. Still, now it's virtual, but up until then, we had been actually going to a yoga studio, and we tried to walk anywhere from 2.5 to 3 miles every day.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Just because you got to, It's,
Yeah.
Use it or lose it, as they say. So,
yeah, right.
And here we are, both in our 70s now.
Yeah.
So, you do tend to stiffen up, and if the back doesn't get you first, the knees will.
Yeah. Jimmy, I want to thank you so much for music through the years and your contribution to bluegrass music and acoustic music. You have been an inspiration to me, and I know countless others, and I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for taking time to talk to me and being on my show.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Well, thank you.